He was the voice of Christmas, the man whose songs wrapped the world in warmth every December. To millions, Bing Crosby wasn't just a star, he was the symbol of comfort, stability, and the perfect American father. But the truth behind that glowing image was far more unsettling. Behind the cheerful melodies and gentle smile lay a household ruled by pressure, perfection, and a chilling confession that shattered the illusion his family tried so hard to maintain. His sons weren't raised in the magical world fans imagined. They grew up under the weight of silence, emotional distance, and expectations so suffocating they left scars the public never saw. And while America celebrated him as an icon, his children were wrestling with a darkness that would eventually consume them. Today, the truth behind that facade finally comes into focus, a truth far more heartbreaking than anyone ever expected. Years later, one of Bing Crosby's own sons finally broke the silence that had been buried under decades of Christmas songs, movie reruns, and carefully polished nostalgia. And when he spoke, the truth he revealed didn't just change how the world saw his father. It exposed a generational tragedy that had been quietly growing beneath the surface of America's most beloved family. Gary Crosby was the first to step forward, the first to peel back the glittering curtain. He had grown up in studios, on radio stages, singing beside a man the world considered flawless. As a teenager, he stood next to Bing on national broadcasts, trying to match a voice the entire country worshipped. But behind the microphones, he was just a boy struggling to breathe under a weight no child should ever carry. His early roles in films and television gave him exposure but not freedom. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how many shows he appeared in, producers didn't see Gary Crosby, they saw only Bing's son, a lens that erased individuality and magnified every flaw. Dennis faced similar cracks beneath the spotlight. He appeared in small films, westerns, guest roles, and scattered television parts, but every opportunity came with a silent curse. Nobody asked if he was talented, they asked if he was as good as Bing. Lindsay tried to escape into supporting roles in short-form television, hoping smaller steps would allow him to build an identity of his own. Philip, quieter than the rest, served in the army and occasionally appeared in music programs, but carried the same invisible burden. 4 brothers, 4 different paths, all haunted by one impossible expectation: to live up to a man the world believed was perfect professionally. Each son fought to create something separate, something uniquely theirs. Yet every project, every audition, every performance was overshadowed by a single question whispered by critics, fans, and even relatives: but is he like his father? It was a comparison none of them could win. Their individuality was dismissed before it had a chance to breathe, and each small success was measured against their father's towering legacy, a legacy built so high there was no path around it, only the crushing shadow beneath. Dennis once confessed privately, "I don't even know what success is. Every time I try something, people compare me to him, and I never win." That sentence revealed a lifetime of emotional exhaustion. Their failures weren't simply personal missteps, they were treated as reflections of the family, proof that the next generation couldn't carry the name with the same shine. Even when one of them performed well, the praise felt muted, hollow, because it was never really for them. The world didn't want Gary, Dennis, Lindsay, or Philip. It wanted another Bing. And when that didn't happen, the disappointment hung in the air like a fog they could never outrun. Inside the family, the pressure wasn't just emotional, it was unrelenting. Approval was rare. Recognition was inconsistent. The boys grew up constantly trying to earn a nod, a word, a moment of validation from a man the nation adored but whose expectations at home were far more rigid. Their father demanded discipline, perfection, strength, and silence. And in their efforts to meet those expectations, the 4 boys spent their childhoods competing with a ghost, the ideal version of Bing Crosby the world adored, a version even he couldn't live up to privately. The result was a lifetime of quiet heartbreak, missed affection, and an invisible emotional war that none of them were fully prepared to fight. By adulthood, each brother was left trying to climb out from under the colossal weight of a last name that opened doors, while simultaneously crushing everything inside them. Their struggles weren't due to lack of talent or lack of opportunity, but the suffocating reality of growing up in a household where perfection was demanded, vulnerability was discouraged, and individuality was swallowed whole by the myth of a man the audience believed they knew. Their careers didn't collapse because they lacked talent or effort. They collapsed because the world refused to let them start as individuals. Every producer, every casting director, every journalist walked into a room already holding a silent scorecard titled Bing Crosby's son. Before any of them opened their mouths, the verdict had already been written. Opportunities came, but most were poisoned with expectations. Sometimes they were hired solely because of the Crosby name, and sometimes they were rejected for that exact same reason. It created a professional trap where they could neither win nor escape, long before they had the chance to prove who they were. The industry stamped them with an identity they never asked for, an identity they could never live up to. The pressure mutated into confusion, resentment, and eventually exhaustion. Slowly, each son drifted away from the entertainment world that once felt like a promise of purpose. For some, the exit was abrupt. For others it was a slow retreat driven by heartbreak, disappointment, and the growing belief that no matter how hard they worked, they would always be judged as not good enough. And when their careers failed to give them stability, their personal lives began to collapse even faster down inside each of them. Storms were building, storms that would eventually become tragic. When their careers no longer offered a way out, Gary, Dennis, and Lindsay found themselves battling emotional chaos they didn't know how to name. The heart of the Crosby home was silence. Silence after mistakes. Silence after punishments. Silence after years of feeling like they weren't measuring up. Gary Crosby finally broke decades of secrecy in his memoir, revealing the darker side of their childhood, the strict discipline, the belt, the emotional distance, and the constant sense that any small misstep was a failure of character. He admitted he began drinking when he was still young because alcohol was the only thing that quieted the inner voice screaming that he wasn't good enough to carry the Crosby name. "If I stayed drunk long enough," he wrote, "I wouldn't feel bad about not being a Crosby." That sentence alone exposed years of emotional wounds buried under holiday songs and polished smiles. Dennis and Lindsay never published memoirs, but the signs of their trauma were unmistakable. Broken marriages, legal troubles, hospital stays, and battles with alcoholism painted a devastating picture. Lindsay cycled in and out of treatment centers, his mental health deteriorating steadily as he struggled with depression and an overwhelming sense of failure. Dennis suffered similar patterns: addiction, instability, and long periods of isolation where he withdrew from the world. Their emotional injuries weren't isolated incidents. They were part of the same internal collapse that began in childhood and intensified in adulthood. Even their bond as brothers eroded. The four sons, each carrying their own private agony, drifted apart over time. The differences in personality, the competition, the unspoken pain, all of it made closeness nearly impossible. They appeared together occasionally in the early years, but by the 1970s their paths had separated completely, each brother spiraling in his own direction. Alone. Bing Crosby, meanwhile, grew older without ever truly repairing the damage. He acknowledged publicly almost casually that he wasn't a good father, but he took no real steps to mend the relationships or heal the wounds. His children rarely appeared at major events connected to him, and they spoke even less about him in the press. Birthdays, holidays, milestones, they passed quietly, with distance instead of unity. It was as though everyone in the family had learned to survive by staying apart. Dennis once confessed to a friend, "I don't know what I'm trying to do anymore. My career is failing. My family is estranged. I'm exhausted." That single line revealed the emotional collapse behind the public silence. Lindsay's depression grew so severe that he stopped engaging with friends and family altogether. Reports from those closest to him described long periods of isolation, erratic behavior, and hospitalizations that offered only temporary relief. Philip, though quiet and private, battled alcoholism as well, though he rarely shared his struggles publicly. The pattern was unmistakable. All four brothers were trapped in the same cycle of emotional damage. Every one of them carried the weight of a childhood built on pressure, fear, and emotional distance. Every one of them struggled to define who they were outside the shadow of a man adored by the world, but often emotionally unreachable at home. And every one of them bore psychological scars that shaped every decision they made. Their turmoil wasn't random or coincidental. It was the unavoidable result of growing up in a family that demanded perfection while offering very little understanding, support, or compassion. By the time the world finally learned the truth, the damage had already carved itself deep into each of their lives. Their suffering didn't end with childhood. The discipline, the emotional distance, the impossible expectations, and the lifelong belief that they were never good enough followed them into adulthood like a shadow that grew darker with every passing year. What began as strict upbringing slowly evolved into a psychological cage none of them could escape. The wounds their father left intentionally or not became the blueprint of their lives. They tried to build families, careers, and identities of their own, but every attempt fractured under the weight of old trauma. The pressure didn't disappear as they grew older. It intensified. And when there was no more career to chase, no more spotlight to hide behind, and no more energy left to pretend, tragedy became the final chapter none of them could rewrite. That tragedy arrived brutally and without warning. On December 11, 1989, Lindsay Crosby was found dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was just 51. 2 years later, on May 4, 1991, Dennis Crosby followed the same path, ending his life in nearly the same manner. Two brothers, two separate spirals, two devastating endings, but both shaped by the same unhealed pain. Their deaths weren't random or sudden. They were the tragic result of years of emotional instability, untreated depression, addiction, and the crushing feeling that nothing they did in life was ever enough. Lindsay, the quietest of the brothers, had spent years drifting between failed treatments, broken relationships, financial instability, and long periods of isolation. By the end, he was unemployed, dependent on family support, and drowning in a depression that no medication seemed able to lift. Dennis's story unfolded with the same painful rhythm: legal disputes, failed relationships, battles with alcoholism, and repeated attempts to stabilize his life all ended in disappointment. His suicide note contained no dramatic explanations, just an apology. A heartbreaking whisper from a man who carried too many years of guilt, exhaustion, and loneliness. The family released minimal information, burying the details in silence. But the truth behind closed doors was unmistakable. Lindsay and Dennis were casualties of emotional wounds that had been left untreated for a lifetime. Philip stayed silent, retreating even further into privacy. Gary, the only one who had ever spoken openly, addressed the deaths not through interviews, but through the lines he had already written years earlier. There were cracks in this house that, without real love, only grew deeper. Bing Crosby, who had died in 1977, had once confessed that he gave his children too much discipline, too much money, and too little time. After the suicides of his sons, those words became a haunting confession echoed across decades. He had raised them with rigid rules, emotional distance, and standards no child could reach. And in their final acts, those sons carried the weight of that truth to their graves. No public funerals were held. No statements were released beyond the bare facts confirmed by the coroner. It was as if the family believed speaking aloud the pain would only make it worse. Those close to the Crosbys admitted that the signs had been visible for years, signs of depression, addiction, broken connections, and an emotional heaviness that never lifted. Everyone sensed it was coming, said one family friend. They just didn't know when. It wasn't a matter of sudden crisis. It was a slow erosion, a lifetime of heartbreak that finally reached its breaking point. The brothers had spent their lives trying to rise above a childhood filled with pressure, fear, and silence. But the scars were too deep, the identity crisis too consuming, and the shadows of the Crosby name too heavy to outrun. Their deaths weren't triggered by a single moment. They were the result of years of feeling unseen, unheard, and unloved. And when the final silence fell, those who remained were forced to confront a devastating truth. Sometimes the greatest tragedies don't happen in the spotlight. They happen quietly, behind closed doors, in families that the world believes are untouchable. What began decades earlier never truly ended. The discipline, the fear, the emotional distance, and the silent wounds didn't fade with time. They simply shifted into the memories of those who survived. And for the Crosby family, the one left carrying the heaviest weight was the eldest son, Gary. After the deaths of Lindsay and Dennis, Gary became the last living reminder of the family that once seemed picture-perfect to the outside world. But behind that image was a man who had spent most of his life fighting the same demons his brothers never escaped. Alcoholism took a toll on his body, the past took a toll on his mind, and by the time Gary passed away in 1995 at age 62, he had spent years trying to make sense of a childhood that shaped and scarred all four brothers before his death. Gary did the one thing none of the others could. He told the truth. His memoir, Going My Own Way, wasn't written out of anger or revenge. It was written to document what really happened inside the home America once believed was the gold standard of family life. Gary described Bing as a man who knew how to charm the world but struggled to connect with his own children. In public, he was warm and beloved. At home, he was distant, strict, and emotionally inaccessible. One of Gary's most painful lines remains etched into the cultural memory of the Crosby story. "I can't remember the last time he said anything encouraging to me. Everything he said was either a correction or a command." It was the kind of confession that made the world rethink everything they thought they knew about Bing Crosby. Philip Crosby, Dennis's twin, stayed silent throughout the controversies. He never wrote a memoir, never gave a detailed interview, and never publicly defended or denied anything Gary wrote. Instead, Philip quietly appeared at a few memorial concerts for his father, then withdrew from the public eye entirely. He lived a private life until his death in 2004 at age 69, still battling alcoholism and having undergone several inpatient treatments. Those closest to the family often said Philip's silence was not denial, it was quiet confirmation. He didn't need to say the words. His life told the story for him. Bing Crosby himself died in 1977, long before the family tragedies reached their breaking point. But one interview from the late 1950s resurfaced after his sons' deaths, and it became a haunting confession of what had gone wrong. Bing admitted, "I think I failed as a father. I gave my children too much discipline, too much money, and too little time." But even that admission came with no follow-up, no apology, no healing, and no attempt to repair the emotional fractures that had formed in his home. He acknowledged the damage, but he never tried to undo it. Materially, his sons lacked nothing. They grew up in comfort, surrounded by wealth and privilege, but emotionally, they lived with scarcity, a lack of warmth, connection, and affirmation. For Bing, love was expressed through expectations, demands, and silence. The children learned early that affection was conditional. Gary described their relationship as a quiet, unspoken contract. If they behaved perfectly, they'd be left alone. If they didn't, they'd feel the consequences. It was a dangerous emotional landscape for any child to grow up in, and for the Crosby boys, it shaped their entire lives. What adds another layer of complexity is how different the story became for Bing's second family. The children he had with his second wife, Catherine, grew up in a home with none of the publicized tragedies. none of the addiction issues, and none of the deep emotional fractures. Catherine often said Bing was gentler, softer, more communicative in his later years. Perhaps it was maturity, perhaps regret, or perhaps the simple passage of time. But whatever change occurred, it came too late for the 4 sons from his first marriage. By then, the damage had already taken root. The apologies were never spoken. The reconciliation never came. The pain was never addressed. And so the first 4 Crosby sons carried their wounds into adulthood, into their careers, into their relationships, and ultimately into their final decisions. The changes in Bing's later life may have brought peace to his second family, but for Gary, Lindsay, Dennis, and even Philip, the healing they needed never arrived. Their stories remained unfinished, their voices unheard, and their trauma unresolved, a legacy of silence passed down from the father the world adored. But they never truly knew. All that remained in the end were a few words from an old interview and a trail of tragedies that unfolded long after the applause faded. Gary Crosby became the only one who chose to speak, the only brother willing to break the silence that had buried his family for decades. He didn't write to destroy his father's image or to gain sympathy. He wrote because his brothers could not. He wrote because the world saw the perfect Christmas icon. The smiling entertainer, the man who brought warmth into every home, yet none of that warmth ever reached his children. Going My Own Way wasn't just a memoir. It was a cry from a son who grew up wanting love but received only discipline, expectations, and distance. In those pages, Gary described beatings, emotional neglect, and long stretches of silence that left deeper marks than any headline ever would. He remembered dinners without laughter, performances that weren't choices but obligations, and moments where he felt more like a background prop in someone else's life than a child with his own identity. His words gave voice to Dennis and Lindsay, 2 brothers who later died alone with secrets they never found the strength to speak aloud. Gary exposed the truth gently, not out of bitterness but because honesty was the only thing left to offer. He admitted his own failures, his addictions, and the mistakes that shaped his adulthood. But behind every confession sat the same unanswered question. What might have been different if the love at home matched the love the world felt for Bing Crosby? When Gary died in 1995, people didn't remember him as a Hollywood star. They remembered him as the one Crosby who finally stepped out from behind the spotlight to explain the real cost of a fame-built family. A cost his brothers paid with their lives. His words didn't erase Bing Crosby's contributions to music or film, but they created a more honest picture of what that legacy demanded in private: emotional distance, constant pressure, and wounds deep enough to echo across generations. What Gary left behind wasn't just a book, it was a warning, a reminder that legacy is more than awards or reputation. It is the emotional inheritance passed quietly from parent to child, the affection given, the affection withheld, the silence, the expectations, the scars. The Crosby story is more than a tale of success. It is a lesson about the damage that happens when love is replaced with discipline and identity is replaced with obligation. Behind the fame, behind the flawless songs and polished performances, lived a family that struggled in ways the public never imagined. And their story reminds us that unhealed wounds don't disappear with time. They grow, they spread, and they shape every life they touch. If this story made you pause and think, share your thoughts in the comments below. Like the video, share it with someone who appreciates real stories behind the spotlight, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more powerful, eye-opening narratives like this one. Thank you for watching.